Silence is the only language that says everything and nothing at the same time. You've felt this before. A message left unanswered for longer than it should have taken. A conversation that used to flow easily, now met with short replies, long gaps, or nothing at all. And in that silence, your mind does what every mind does when it's given no information to work with. It starts filling in the blanks. Did I do something wrong? Did they lose interest? Was any of it ever real to begin with? Here is what Carl Jung's work suggests, and it's very different from the story most people tell themselves in moments like this. Silence is rarely empty. It is one of the most communicative things a person can offer you, precisely because it isn't filtered through words. And once you understand what's actually happening inside someone's silence, it stops being a mystery and starts being something you can actually read. We tend to treat silence as an absence, a gap where something should be, evidence of a void. But that framing is almost always wrong. Silence takes effort to maintain. A person who truly felt nothing for you wouldn't need to manage their responses, measure their words, or carefully avoid certain topics. Indifference doesn't require strategy. It simply exists, flatly, without any need for upkeep. The moment silence starts to feel deliberate, effortful, even strained, you are no longer looking at indifference. You are looking at something being actively managed, and things only get actively managed when they matter. There are two very different kinds of silence, and confusing them is where most of the pain in this situation comes from. Let's start with the first one, because it's the one people fear the most, and also the one that's most often misdiagnosed. The first kind of silence is protective. It exists to create distance from something that feels overwhelming. This is the silence that shows up right after closeness, not before it. You had a good conversation, a real moment, something that felt like genuine connection, and then, without warning, the responses got shorter, or stopped altogether. This timing matters enormously, because it tells you something protective silence almost always tells you. It isn't a reaction to something going wrong. It's a reaction to something going right, at a pace the other person's nervous system wasn't prepared to handle. Jung wrote at length about the parts of ourselves we keep hidden because they feel too exposing to bring into the light, the parts he called the shadow. For many people, genuine emotional need lives inside that hidden territory. Wanting someone, fully and without defense, can feel more dangerous than almost anything else, especially for someone who learned early that wanting things openly leads to disappointment. When closeness starts to reach that hidden territory, silence becomes a kind of emergency brake. Not cruelty, not indifference. A nervous system doing exactly what nervous systems are built to do when they sense they're moving too fast towards something they can't fully control. This explains a pattern many people find deeply confusing. Someone who seems genuinely affected by you, and yet retreats immediately after showing it. The retreat isn't proof the feeling wasn't real. It's often proof that it was, and that its size caught the person by surprise. If you're on the receiving end of this kind of silence, it can feel like punishment, like something you did wrong that you're now being made to pay for. But protective silence usually isn't about you specifically. It's about what you represent to someone who isn't ready to face it yet. That distinction won't make the waiting feel easier, but it might stop you from searching for a flaw in yourself that was never actually there. It's worth noticing, too, how much energy protective silence actually requires from the person maintaining it. Every unanswered message is a small decision, repeated. Every urge to respond, and then reconsider, and then not respond, takes something out of a person, even if none of that internal negotiation is visible from your side of the silence. This is part of why protective silence so often breaks down eventually, sometimes suddenly, sometimes with an apology that seems to come out of nowhere. Maintaining distance from something you actually want is exhausting work, and exhaustion has a way of eventually winning out over defense. Now here is the second kind of silence, and it operates in almost the opposite direction, even though from the outside it can look identical. The second kind of silence is not protective, it's transformative. It's the silence of someone who is quietly, internally, coming to terms with something they haven't said out loud yet, even to themselves. This kind of silence often follows a very specific pattern, and once you know what to look for, it becomes easier to distinguish from the first kind. It tends to arrive not immediately after closeness, but after some kind of internal realization, a moment where the person has started to understand how much you actually mean to them, and doesn't yet have language ready for that understanding. Jung believed that real psychological change rarely happens instantly. It moves slowly, beneath conscious awareness, long before it becomes visible in behavior. Someone going through this kind of internal shift often appears distant, distracted, even withdrawn, not because they've stopped feeling something, but because they're in the middle of feeling it more intensely than they know how to express. Words require clarity, and clarity, especially about something as disorienting as falling for someone you didn't expect to fall for, takes time to arrive. This is the silence that so often gets misread as rejection, when it's closer to the opposite. It's the sound of someone's internal world reorganizing itself around a feeling they haven't yet found the courage or the vocabulary to name. There's a reason this kind of silence can feel so different to sit inside, even before you consciously understand why. Protective silence tends to have a flatness to it, a closed-door quality, consistent and unchanging. Transformative silence often has texture. It comes with small inconsistencies, moments where the person seems to almost say something and then doesn't, a quality of distraction rather than absence. If you've ever felt like someone was present with you, while also clearly somewhere else entirely in their own head, that's often exactly what this looks like from the outside. A person mid-process, not a person who has left. So how do you tell these two kinds of silence apart? Because from the outside, in the moment, they can feel painfully similar. There is one reliable signal, and it's less about what happens during the silence and more about what happens around it. Protective silence tends to be accompanied by other signs of active avoidance, cancelled plans, deflected questions, a general pattern of keeping you at arm's length across multiple areas of contact, not just one. Transformative silence tends to be narrower. The person may go quiet in conversation or take longer to respond, while still showing up in smaller, almost involuntary ways, remembering details, checking in unexpectedly, small gestures that don't match the story their silence seems to be telling. If both kinds of behavior are present, it's very possibly not one or the other cleanly, but a mixture. Someone genuinely moving through both at once, protecting themselves and being quietly transformed by the same feeling simultaneously. Human beings are rarely as tidy as a single explanation would suggest. It might help to picture how this actually plays out day to day, rather than only in the abstract. Imagine someone who, a few weeks ago, was texting you regularly, easily, without much thought behind it. Then something shifted. Maybe a conversation went somewhere unexpectedly honest. Maybe you simply spent more time together than either of you planned. And after that, the texting changed. Slower replies, shorter ones, days where nothing arrives at all. If this were pure protective silence, you'd likely notice it extending outward. Fewer attempts to see you in person, vaguer plans, a general cooling across every point of contact. If this is closer to transformative silence, you'll often notice something odd sitting alongside the quiet. They might like something you posted without commenting on it. They might send a single message about something unrelated, almost as if testing whether contact still feels safe. They might show up unexpectedly in a shared space, seemingly by coincidence, more than once. These aren't grand gestures. They're small, almost involuntary signals of a person who hasn't actually left, even though their words have gone quiet. Neither pattern guarantees anything about the future, but learning to notice the difference gives you something more useful than blind hope or complete despair. It gives you an accurate read of what you're actually dealing with, which is worth far more than either extreme. It's also worth acknowledging a third possibility, one that's less comfortable to consider, but important for the sake of honesty. Sometimes silence really is exactly what it appears to be on the surface, a loss of interest, plainly and simply, without any deeper layer beneath it. Not every silence is protective. Not every silence is transformative. Some silences are just endings, arriving quietly instead of announced. The goal here isn't to convince yourself that every silence secretly contains hidden depths of unspoken love. It's to give yourself a more accurate set of possibilities than the single, self-blaming story most people default to, so that whichever one turns out to be true, you arrive at it with more clarity and less unnecessary suffering along the way. There's something else worth understanding here, something that applies regardless of which kind of silence you're facing. Silence, in either form, is not actually about you in the way it feels like it's about you. It's about the internal world of the person holding it, their history, their fears, their pace of processing things that matter. You are the occasion for the silence. You are very rarely its true subject. This distinction matters more than it might seem to at first, because it changes what you're actually allowed to do about it. You cannot talk someone out of protective silence by explaining, yet again, how you feel. You cannot speed up transformative silence by asking more directly what's going on inside them. Both of these responses come from a completely understandable place, the desire to close the gap, to get an answer, to stop the not knowing. But both usually make the situation harder, not easier, because they add pressure to a process that fundamentally cannot be rushed by outside force. What actually works, if anything does, is something much less satisfying in the moment and much more effective over time. It's continuing to exist, clearly and consistently, as someone safe to eventually return to, without organizing your entire emotional state around when or whether that return happens. This is harder than it sounds, and it's worth being honest about that, rather than pretending it's a simple switch to flip. Staying grounded while someone else works through their own silence requires a kind of discipline most people aren't taught anywhere. It means resisting the urge to send one more message that might tip the balance. It means tolerating the discomfort of not knowing, without converting that discomfort into action, just to relieve the tension of sitting with it. And it means continuing to invest in your own life, your friendships, your work, your own sense of who you are, rather than quietly pausing everything while you wait for someone else's clarity to arrive. Jung's concept of individuation describes the long, often difficult process of a person becoming fully themselves, integrating the parts of their inner life they've kept hidden with the parts they show the world. Silence, in many of these situations, is simply what that process looks like from the outside. Uncomfortable to witness, impossible to accelerate, but not, in itself, evidence that nothing is happening. If you've been sitting inside someone else's silence, wondering what it means, wondering if it means anything at all, here is what's worth carrying forward from all of this. Silence is data, not a verdict. It tells you that something is happening beneath the surface. It does not tell you, on its own, how the story ends. What it also does not tell you is that you're required to wait indefinitely to find out. There is a real difference between staying open to someone's process and putting your own life on hold while that process unfolds on a timeline you don't control. You can hold both truths at once. Their silence may be meaningful. Your life still deserves to move forward while you find out what that meaning turns out to be. There's a specific trap worth naming here, because so many thoughtful, emotionally intelligent people fall into it without realizing. It's the trap of becoming an expert interpreter of someone else's silence while quietly neglecting your own need for clarity. You can become so skilled at generating compassionate explanations for why someone isn't communicating that you forget you're also allowed to ask, plainly, for something different. Understanding why someone struggles to speak is not the same as agreeing to live indefinitely without being spoken to. Both things can be true. You can understand their silence and still decide, at some point, that you need more than silence in return. Carl Jung's work never promised easy answers about other people, and it doesn't provide one here either. What it offers instead is something quieter but more durable, a way of understanding silence that doesn't require you to fill it with your worst fears or your most desperate hopes, just to feel like you have some kind of answer. Sometimes the most honest answer is simply this: something is happening. It isn't finished yet, and you are allowed to keep living fully while it works itself out. If this helped you make sense of a silence you've been sitting inside, that's exactly what this was made for.